poll taken a few months ago indicated that the larger part of the American public does not believe that the assassination of President Kennedy was the work solely of Lee Harvey Oswald, and rather the public seems to believe that some plot of larger scope was involved. We have had on this program in recent years a number of conspiracy specialists who have interpreted with evidence they thought available to them the nature of that larger conspiracy. Jim Garrison, the former district attorney of New Orleans, has been our guest. Mark Lane, the New York lawyer. Bernard Fensterwald, the Washington lawyer, and both of them have their own views of the conspiracy that did occur in Dallas. Michael Eddows, a British solicitor, has yet another view of the nature of the plot, a most astonishing view, I must say, and it is argued almost in the form of a legal brief in the very well-written and inevitably very compelling book, The Oswald File, by Michael Eddows, that book just recently published in this country by Potter. Mr. Eddows, I want to get right into this, and the best way I know is to ask you to read to us the 9 points that follow this sentence on the first page of your book. You say, I will endeavor to prove beyond reasonable doubt what?
1. That after Kennedy was elected and subsequently opposed the aggressive moves of Soviet Premier Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev, the latter ordered his assassination through the Soviet secret police, MVD. 2. That the real ex-Marine Lee Harvey Oswald never returned to the United States, but disappeared shortly after his arrival in the Soviet Union in 1959. 3. That the man who assassinated Kennedy in 1963 was a member of Department 13, the sabotage and assassination squad of the Soviet State Security Service, KGB, and in 1962 had entered the United States in the guise of Oswald. 4. That the Soviets intended that after the assassination the imposture would be discovered by the United States authorities. 5. That a confusing chain of evidence had been created, placing responsibility for the assassination on the Cubans or the Soviets in that order. 6. That because the assassin failed to escape, before 9 p.m. on the day of the assassination, the authorities suspected that the assassin was a Soviet imposter and a member of Department 13. 7. That on the day after the assassination, their suspicions were confirmed. 8. That to avoid the possibility of World War III, it was at once decided that all evidence of imposture and Soviet conspiracy be withheld from the world. 9. That the assassination was an act of war, and that the Warren Report inevitably was a declaration of peace and incidentally an admission of defeat.
Thank you, sir. There we have a clear statement of the theoretical interpretation. We have not yet looked at the evidence. We will do that tonight. And we are joined in this conversation by an expert on evidence, Elmer Gertz, who, by common consensus in the Chicago legal profession, is considered the inheritor of the mantle of Darrow himself. Elmer Gertz was one of the counsel to Jack Ruby on his appeal, an appeal that was won so that, as you pointed out to me before the program, Elmer, Ruby, in fact, when he died, stood unconvicted of anything. You also wrote a review of Mr. Eddows' book, which was published, I think, in the Daily News just a little while ago, and you seem not to be persuaded by his evidence. Why not?
The statements made by Mr. Eddows are very intriguing, and as to some of them, he presents a good deal of very interesting material. But at the very least, I would say, in language familiar to Mr. Eddows, that there has to be a Scotch verdict, not proved. I don't think there is any proof of any of these assertions. There's one aspect, however, of what Mr. Eddows said that interests me and impresses me. Most of those who are critical of the Warren Report seem to believe that the person identified by the police as Lee Harvey Oswald did not kill President Kennedy.
Whereas Mr. Eddows says, yes, that man did, but he wasn't the real Lee Harvey Oswald.
There was another one. But at any rate, it's, to my mind, quite an improvement on those who, in spite of all of the evidence, the guilt of the one whom we know as Oswald, persist there was someone else, that Oswald was, to them, was almost a victim of someone or other.
Well, I have difficulty at that very point, because I have become persuaded, up till the time that I read your book, Mr. Eddows, and I may still be persuaded, that the ballistics evidence suggests that if somebody shot from that 6th floor room in the Texas Book Depository, that person alone could not have done the assassination. That the ballistics evidence indicates there was a shot from the grassy knoll, and furthermore that you couldn't have got that many accurate shots off in that small space of time.
No, I don't think so. Let me briefly, Mr. Eddows is entitled to dominate this show. It's his book, but I'd like to say a few things at any rate. I think that those who talk about some of the shots being fired from in front or the grassy knoll simply are talking nonsense. Anyone who planned on killing the President of the United States would want to make certain that he succeeded. Now, the only place from which you could get an aim at the President and succeed in killing him was from above at a considerable distance so that you'd be able to follow the car and get what you call a bead on him.
Yes.
Anyone shooting from the front would have to contend with heavy plate glass. It would be rather silly to think of killing the President when you have plate glass intervening. If they shot from the side, they're grassy now, they'd only have a moment or so to get a proper aim, and they couldn't succeed in it. So it seems to me very clear that it must have been from the rear and above. Otherwise, nothing else. The assassination could not have taken place.
But that is a point of agreement between the two of you. The shots came from that window in the Texas Book Depository.
May I add something to that? I have stood on the grassy knoll many times, of course. Anybody firing from there would have been arrested without the slightest doubt. And that is the last thing the conspirators want, of course, for one of the conspirators to be arrested. As it was, the assassin failed to escape, although he had very good opportunity to do so, yet he failed. Two of them trying to escape, one of them would certainly have been arrested. So you're absolutely right, Mr. Gert.
You know, Mr. Eddows, I must tell you, you remind me of another Englishman whose work I find very interesting, though he's in a totally different area. I speak of the distinguished astronomer, Sir Fred Hoyle.
Oh, yes.
Who years ago proposed a very audacious hypothesis that matter is spontaneously created in space at a certain constant rate, and that accounts for the even distribution of hydrogen molecules through all of observable space. The spontaneous creation of matter. And Hoyle put that hypothesis forward. He has since retracted it, saying, I know it's an audacious hypothesis, and an astonishing one, and an incredible one, but it is the only one that makes sense out of the available observations. You seem to be taking the same tack with regard to the assassination of President Kennedy.
What Mr. Eddows says is certainly audacious.
Yes, I agree.
Well, we've got to get to the false Oswald. What you seem to be suggesting is that Lee Harvey Oswald was recruited to come over and be a young communist in the Soviet Union, and all of that was done in advance by the KGB so they could then replace him by an agent selected because he looked somewhat like Oswald and could be trained to go in as a professional assassin. Yet when the Oswald, in quotes, came back and visited with his mother and his brother and his half-brother, they did accept him as their beloved Lee Harvey Oswald.
Oh, yes. They did. They'd been told by the State Department that the real Lee Harvey Oswald was returning.
Well, it seems rather incredible to me that a mother who hadn't seen her son for perhaps 2 years, or was it 3, could be taken in. Now, one would think that a mother would know whether she was looking at her own son or not.
Yes, one would have thought that. But they accepted the man who returned rather than recognized him. And the mother, in November 1975, in the Dallas Morning News, in a subheading, Mrs. Oswald wants exhumation, and further down, having read the script of this book, Eddows is on the right track, and he didn't get it from me. I have this document here that I desperately want to see.
Mr. Eddows, don't you think that she's rather an erratic woman? You wouldn't care to have her as a witness if you were trying to prove a case, would you?
Well, you know, I considered her testimony before the Warren Commission to be the most interesting of all the testimony given. When I first read it, it looked very confused, and I thought, well, this is ridiculous. But when I became much more aware of the contents of the 26 volumes, I reread her testimony many times, and she was not stupid in her testimony.
Yet her thesis was that her son was really an agent for the United States government.
Yeah, that is ridiculous, of course.
And that was her principal contention.
Well, it may be ridiculous, but many of the other conspiracy theories make a great deal of his earlier FBI and possibly CIA contacts, and indeed, Jim Garrison's overall view is that the assassination was undertaken by a deviant group within the CIA and by Cuban refugees who were angry at President Kennedy's failure to support them during and after the Bay of Pigs.
If anything I would say about Mr. Garrison is likely to be regarded as libelous or obscene, and so I will refrain from characterizing him. I think Margaret, well, at least is in good faith. I don't think Jim Garrison is. I think that anyone who contends there is a conspiracy has a very heavy burden. After all, in all of these years, there has been very little that you could call direct or even circumstantial evidence of a conspiracy.
Well, the basic question that we must now put to Michael Eddows, and I want to put the question now, then we'll pause for some necessary commercials, and we'll get your answer directly after that. The basic and simple question is, where is the evidence that the Lee Harvey Oswald who went to Russia stayed in Russia, and that another different person calling himself Lee Harvey Oswald returned? It seems to me we must look at the available evidence, of course, that suggests that conclusion. And we'll do that right after these words. Jerry Golden. Our guests are Michael Eddows, the author of the new book, The Oswald File, and Elmer Gertz, who's responsible for some 10 or 11 books, and one of them is Moment of Madness, The People versus Jack Ruby. Mr. Eddows, down to the case material. Where is the evidence that there are two Oswalds, or that there were two Oswalds?
Well, I will try and divide it into two sections. First, I will take the medical evidence supplied by the Marines and the medical evidence supplied by the autopsy on the corpse of the assassin. Now, the real Oswald joined the Marines when he was just 17. His height was recorded as 5'8". After 10 weeks training, on 28 December 1956, his height was again recorded, and he had grown 1 inch and put on several pounds in weight, which is not unusual. Nearly 3 years later, he wrote to the Albert Schweitzer College in Switzerland, asking if he could attend the spring term in 1960. And on the application form, he gave his height as 5'11". 3 months after that, he had a full medical examination before leaving the Marines. The officer conducting the examination was Lieutenant Vincent. He was, of course, a doctor. And he records the height of the Marine as 5'11" inches. 8 days later, the Marine was again measured by Lieutenant Ayres, who recorded his height as 5'11" inches and a slightly different weight, thereby proving that Ayres was not merely copying what Vincent had written. So we have a 5'11" man leaving the Marines. Now, that 5'11" man applied for a passport. On the passport application, he said, my height is 5'11". He was issued with a passport showing his height to be 5'11". Now we come to the heights of the assassin. Now, the assassin was, without any shadow of doubt, 5'9". He was measured by the New Orleans police. He was measured by the Dallas police. His corpse was measured by the autopsy doctors. So here we have immediately a discrepancy of 2 inches. So that is the first thing that one notices. Now, on the autopsy of the assassin, the doctors, Rose and Stewart, failed apparently to notice a mastoidectomy which the young real Lee Harvey Oswald had suffered at the age of 6. They failed to notice it because presumably it was not there. The Marine records record that the real Lee Harvey Oswald had a mastoidectomy with a 1-inch scar and, in fact, the removal of the mastoid bone. Now,
so that should have been visible directly behind the ear.
Yes, of course.
That, of course, is very impressive testimony, but you acknowledge the fact that the fingerprints of both Oswalds...
Oh, may we come to the fingerprints later?
Wait.
Yes. May I finish with this? Now,
that's the main argument in the rebuttal, I gather, that the fingerprints
one of the arguments
coincide. The fingerprints of the dead assassin coincide with earlier fingerprints available on Oswald from his Marine days.
Testimony is supposed to be as nearly infallible as any testimony.
We'll allow Mr. Eddows to defer his response on that and develop his argument as if he were before the court.
Now, in addition to the apparently absent mastoidectomy, the real Lee Harvey Oswald, when in the Marines, had shot himself in the arm. And there were 2 scars as a result of this slight wound. She also had a third scar on the upper left arm. Now, the autopsy doctors only recorded 2 scars on the upper left arm, and they were in the wrong position. They were, so to speak, upside down. They put the bullet entering from above instead of from below, as recorded on the marine record, and the excision of the bullet below instead of above. And one of the scars was on the wrong side of the arm. So that the differences between the autopsy report and the marine medical report come to 7. And that's quite a lot. Now we come to point 2. What did the relatives notice? Well, first of all, we have the mother, who testified that she saw that her son had lost some hair, and he told her that it had been caused by the cold weather. She searched her medical dictionary to find a prescription against baldness. He had also become very, very thin. This was her testament to the Warren Commission. His brother Robert said as follows to the Commission: Lee's complexion had changed somewhat, to the extent that he had always been very fair-complected. His complexion was rather ruddy at this time, 1962. You might say it appeared like an artificial suntan that you get out of a bottle. Very slight, in other words, a tint of brown to a tint of yellow. It appeared to him that Lee had picked up something of an accent, but Robert put it down to Lee's having been in Russia for 2.5 years and having spoken only the Russian language. He said that Lee's hair used to be brown and curly, a full set of hair. He had pointed out to Lee the difference in his hair, and actually made him bend his head down to where I could look at the top of it, and it was very thin on top. You could see just right down to the scalp. Lee said it had been caused by the cold weather. Robert said there was no tendency to baldness in any members of his family, and he thought that the thinness of the hair was due to shock treatments or something along that line that had been given to his brother Lee while he was in Russia.
Did Robert say he didn't think it was his brother?
Oh, no.
None of them said that originally.
Oh, no, of course not. They never suspected it for one moment.
When I go home and see my mother, she often says to me, "You don't look the same.
You're not eating.
You're not eating, or you're eating." Well, what she's more likely to say is you're eating too much, as a matter of fact.
May I continue?
Please.
The half-brother of the real Oswald, who hadn't seen the real Oswald for 10 years, was asked by the Commission, "Did you recognize him?" And he replied, "I would never have recognized him, sir, because he had lost his bull neck, he'd got very thin, he'd lost his hair, and the half-brother, whose name was John Pick, was, quotes, mad, unquotes, because the man he thought was Lee introduced him to a stranger on this particular occasion, the only occasion half-brother saw him after he'd returned to the United States, introduced him as half-brother, and they had always previously called each other brother." This is just the sort of slip a trained assassin might make.
This is WGN Clear Channel Radio from Chicago. I'm very eager to hear Elmer Gertz's response. These discrepancies between the earlier appearance of Oswald and the later appearance of Oswald, and most particularly the discrepancy with regard to recorded height, this is impressive information, despite the correspondence of fingerprints. And at the moment, I'm confused.
Despite, all human beings change from time to time. Before the Russians or anyone else of sound mind would send anyone to the state, they would have to make certain that there was similarity of appearance in voice, in knowledge, in associations. Obviously, it would not be an easy thing to deceive anybody in the matter. So you start out with, I think, with natural skepticism, and you get more than skepticism, in spite of these very impressive things that Mr. Eddows has said, when you find the fingerprints identical. Now, not one set of fingerprints, but several sets of fingerprints. Mr. Eddows suggests in his books that the Russians may have succeeded in changing the prints, substituting the imposters.
Getting the prints of the impostor into the already existing files
which
in
is
this
quite
country.
a job. How it could be done, I'm at a loss to know. The prints obviously were kept in government records and government files, access to which was probably classified, or at least at any rate difficult. You'd have to know where the prints were. And on top of that, you have the basic question: why Lee Harvey Oswald? Why was he selected? Was he the only one, the inevitable choice? why did they have to take an erratic character, a character who, while in the Marine Corps and throughout his life, even before he went to the Marine Corps, had, if not psychiatric record, at least a record of eccentricity and personality defects? I'm at a loss to understand that if the Russians were training somebody to substitute for a genuine American, why they would choose this kind of character for that purpose.
Well, you've asked about 4 questions in one. I know that, and you know that too. Let us deal with, first of all, the character of Lee Harvey Oswald. He came to New York from New Orleans. He didn't like the school, and he wouldn't attend to it. He went to the zoo all the time and rode on the trains. He was sent to a youth hostel, of course, and that is the only evidence that I can find that there was any eccentricity, as you would have it, in his behavior.
Dr. Hartog's issued a report.
What?
Dr.
Hartog, yes, I know.
Issued a report which indicated that at the very least he was not completely normal in his responses as a boy.
Yes.
And recommended therapy, as a matter of fact, at which point his mother fled with him.
Oh, yes.
Which Dr. Hartog's is that, by the way?
That's the one who later was involved in a very
thought so.
sensational case. As a matter of fact, was found guilty of some impropriety.
He was found guilty of having sexual intercourse and forcing sexual intercourse upon one of his female psychiatric patients, in a famous case.
Yes, I know.
More recently.
Yes.
But perhaps that's not relevant to our present discussion.
You see, my view of the real Oswald is that he was a very normal, healthy boy. He liked going on the roof and looking at the stars. His brother had to haul him down from the roof. He liked fishing. He liked all the normal things. And all the photographs of the young Lee Harvey Oswald that appear in the Warren Report show a smiling and very happy child. And according to his relations, who would, of course, say this, he was a very happy, normal child. As Robert said, the boy I knew was healthy and happy, would never have killed anybody.
Mr. Eddows, one thing you don't make sufficiently clear in the book, at least I want more information or more of your thought on this, is who the other Oswald was. You have him a KGB agent, but do you assume that he was an American who was now in the employ of the KGB, or a native Soviet citizen, or just what?
I would say he was exactly how Marina described him when she met him. She thought he was a fellow citizen with a Baltic State accent. He said his name was Alec and that he had no mother. That is her testimony.
Well, now, why would he reveal his some true facts about himself to Marina when he was already supposedly in role as Lee Harvey Oswald?
I've no idea. I've no idea. This is just the testimony. I can't rationalize about it.
How do you account for his purchasing the gun under that pseudonym?
A.J. Haddell.
Yes. What's the meaning of that, do you think?
I think that it was intended by the Russians that if the man escaped, it's essential he should escape. In fact, the whole plot depended upon successful entry into the United States and successful departure from the United States. He failed to depart, and I think that was why Jake Ruby shot him, but that's not what you say, of course.
Well,
now, what was the question? Could you repeat it again?
I'm wondering about the motivation for the use by Oswald, who went aboard the name Oswald, of that pseudonym of Heidel. He carried the identification, as you point out, in this person, the double identification. Lee Harvey Oswald and Alec Heidel. And I'm wondering about that. How do you motivate that?
Well, what I think was the intention, the Russian intention, if my theory is correct, is this. They would be able to say, a 5'11 Marine entered the United States carrying a 5'11 passport. He married a girl called Marina in Minsk, and a passport was handed back to him showing his height at 5'11, and he entered the United States. The real Lee Harvey Oswald entered the United States. This is the Russian story. He's seen by FBI agents Carter and Fain in Fort Worth, and they record, just after he'd entered the United States, his name is Lee Harvey Oswald, height 5'11, and he'd added 2 inches to his wife's height, calling her 5'5", when in fact she is 5'3", according to her Russian records. Now, 17 days after he told the FBI his height was 5'11", he was employed by Leslie Welding in Fort Worth, and on the application form for work he gave his height as 5'9". Thereafter he remained 5'9", and when he was killed he was 5'9". One exception to that was when he applied for a passport in the name of the Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in June 63, when he gave the height of 5'11", because to do otherwise would have aroused suspicion at the passport office, of course.
Gentlemen, I want to raise a larger policy or historical aspect of all of this.
Yes.
In essence, Mr. Eddows, you suggest that the assassination was ordered, or at least confirmed as an order, by no less a figure than Premier Khrushchev himself.
It is so.
Why would it have served Soviet policy to order the assassination of the President of the United States?
Well, I want to say this, Amicia, and I'm sure that three lawyers would agree, that in murder cases, motive should be the last thing you look for. You should follow the evidence to the suspect.
Even if you're puzzled as to why he did it.
Yeah. And then when you've got the suspect, even if you can't find a motive, but the evidence is there, then you convict him. And the general public and most law enforcement officers, unfortunately, some lawyers always say, well, why should he have done it before they even considered the evidence? It should be the reverse procedure, what I call the Sherlock Holmes technique, following the evidence, then think about motive. Now, if you ask me for motive, and everybody does, of course, my immediate reply is I don't want to give a motive because I think it's ancillary to the question. I've not the faintest idea what the motive was. But I do set out to satisfy people what I think the motive was. And I think Vietnam was probably the motive. I think so. See, Kennedy, I think, was going to withdraw troops from Vietnam.
What about this, Mr. Eddows? You yourself quote the imposter, Oswald, as you call him, saying that Lyndon Johnson probably would be the same as John F. Kennedy, would follow the same course. Then why then would the Russians want to kill Kennedy if his successor was going to be no different in policy?
But the successor was entirely different in policy.
But Oswald apparently assumed that there was...
Oh, well, he said that to the police.
I didn't quite follow what you were saying about Vietnam possibly being the motive. By killing President Kennedy, what would the effect be upon American Vietnam policy?
Well, Kennedy had withdrawn 1,000 troops at the time of his death and said he was going to withdraw more troops. I don't know whether he was or not, of course. These are the secrets within the White House.
But do you suggest then the Soviets wanted to keep us committed in Vietnam?
Well, you've asked me for a motive. I don't like giving one. The only motive I can possibly give is that there was a colossal acceleration into Vietnam when there would have been deceleration under Kennedy with disastrous...
But how would it have served, granting this is all very conjectural, and you don't want to give motives, how would it have served Soviet interests to keep us fully committed in Vietnam rather than
to have us out? You can see the result today in the United States. Disillusionment with the American forces.
Yeah. May I go in a different course? Because this is an area where I think I know something. You have... as the co-conspirators with the what you call the imposter Oswald, Jack Ruby and Georgie Morgenstern. Now, to me, it is utterly preposterous to link Jack Ruby with Oswald and with any conspiracy.
At this point, Elmer, I suppose we should make clear that according to Michael Eddows' interpretation, Jack Ruby was in essence assigned by the KGB to kill false
Oswald when he did not escape. Well, to me, that's simply passive belief. Even if I accepted everything else that you said, and I recognize that Ruby is really not essential to your thesis. You could be completely wrong about Ruby, and conceivably you could be right about the other thing.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Now, Ruby, from what I knew of him, and I knew him very well, seeing him many times, talking endlessly with him, seeing him in prison, in court, corresponding with him, taking his deathbed statement. The surest thing you could say about Ruby, and everyone who knew him would say this, that he was a compulsive talker. He could never shut his mouth. If he had been involved in anything, conspiracy or any conduct, the whole world would have known in a short period of time.
Well, it's exactly what he did say during his testimony to the Warren Commission. He said there was a conspiracy.
Well, no. I've read... no.
Yes, he
to the last breath, he puzzled over the fact of his having killed Oswald. He said, God must have been against me that I happened to be there. It was just fortuitous that he was in the basement. I think I could demonstrate with almost mathematical certainty that except for the chance call by the stripper who worked for him, he would never have gotten up that Sunday morning when it was generally understood Oswald was going to be moved about 10 in the morning. Admittedly, Ruby was at the Western Union station, several hundred feet away from the police station, at 11:17 because there was a time clock showing when the money was wired. All the evidence is that he got no call while he was in the Western Union station. He was unhurried. That there was nothing to indicate that he had his mind set on going anywhere, whether the police station or anywhere else. And he got into the police station because the one policeman who was supposed to guard the entrance, and that was preposterous, that should certainly have had more than one policeman, had his attention attracted by an automobile driven by a couple of us. Yes. And that policeman went over there, and Ruby, without even knowing he was getting in at that opportune moment, just walked down. And by sheer chance, because nobody knew when Oswald's examination was going to be completed, at the moment that Ruby arrived at the foot of the ramp, Oswald came out, and by reflex, he killed him. There's nothing to indicate it was anything except that. Every bit of evidence I've seen, including statements taken from Ruby for defense purposes. In my book, for example, I have a moment-by-moment account by Ruby of all he did for the 2 days preceding the killing of Oswald.
I await with eagerness Michael Eddows' response to that point registered by Elmer Gertz, and we'll get back to this conversation right after these words. Thank you very much, Jerry Golden. Our guest tonight, Elmer Gertz, professor of law at the John Marshall Law School, author of the book Moment of Madness, The People versus Jack Ruby. That book was published in 1968. I hope it's still in print. And Michael Eddows, a British solicitor, who is the author of the book The Oswald File. That book just published in this country by Potter. And I should make clear, I suppose, Mr. Eddows, that you did the research on this book over a period of some 12 years or more.
14 years. I started 5 months before Kennedy was killed.
5 months before Kennedy?
Before, in June 1963.
What was there to investigate before Kennedy was killed?
Well, in London, I was the patient of a London osteopath, Dr. Stephen Ward. He was a very distinguished osteopath, aged 50, he treated Winston Churchill, members of the cabinet, and lots of lesser people like myself, actresses, all sorts of people.
And John Profumo, as I remember.
Well, he knew him, but he didn't treat him. Now, Stephen Ward was a great friend of Captain Evgeny Ivanov, who was a Russian intelligence officer stationed in London. Of course, nobody knew Ward's friend was a Russian intelligence officer. He had a cover post of a naval attaché. I came by certain information as I was a student of Stephen Ward. I heard one or two telephone calls while he was treating me and so on. And I put in a full report to security, 6-page report. I took to my own lawyers and to counsel and gave it to security, saying that the unfortunate Mr. John Profumo was sharing a girl with a Russian naval attaché. I didn't know he was a Russian intelligence officer. I was told to drop it by the authorities. I didn't drop it, and 3 months later John Profumo confessed that he'd lied in the House of Commons, and he resigned as Minister for War and his membership of Parliament, of course. Well, I had some leads to New York, because I got very interested in this. I realized it was far more serious. And as you see at the beginning of my book, that I came to New York at the invitation of the Journal American. They wanted me to write sick articles for them. I said yes. They said they pay my expenses. I said no, I don't want any expenses paid. All I want is for you to find out a bit of information for me. I won't tell you what it was, but I wanted a piece of information. They agreed to do this. In fact, they did find it out for me, but I had to come to New York to get it. While I was in New York, a couple of days after I'd arrived, John Malone, head of the New York FBI, asked if he could see me. I consented, of course. I had my assistant, who was an ex-policeman, with me. And we had 3 long 2-hour interviews. And the result of those interviews were that I discovered that the group in London who destroyed Profumo had sent a young woman to New York, Maria Novotny, to destroy the character of President Kennedy. She was the cousin of President Novotny of Czechoslovakia. This is a fact. She said all this herself in the press in the last 1972. She told the whole story. She came here to destroy the character of President Kennedy between his election and inauguration. Absolutely fantastic story. And I suppose these 3 interviews are the most dramatic moments of my life. Because in addition to that, the most extraordinary thing happened. The Pentagon, when the FBI had seen me a couple of times, got in touch with the newspaper and asked if I could get some information when I returned to London about the penetration of the Relay and Communications Department of NATO, situated at Ruislip just outside London. I said, well, if you have the reports I put into security, I don't think anybody I mentioned in my report wants to speak to me again. I can't get the information. This is amazing. The Pentagon then gave to a trusted employee of the Journal American the secret number of the most secret department of all NATO, the Relay and Communications Department. And we had to find out whether the young lady involved with Mr. Profumo was known to these three men. And my assistant made a brilliant suggestion. He said, let's ring up the secret department. That's from the Journal American. So we did, and we listened on extension to the telephone. We got the colonel out of bed, and we were asked to speak to Sergeant X. Well, it's a little late, isn't it? Well, we said, it's rather important to the Journal American. What very well. Sergeant X got out of bed. Oh, you Sergeant X? No, this is Journal American. We're doing this story at the moment. We believe you know Miss X. Yeah, sure I do. Bang. We got it. The group in London had penetrated the Relay and Communications Department of NATO. 3 men were flown back from Ruislip, London, to Washington the next day, and that's all in the New York press. The New York Times, I think it's in. So that whole adventure of mine, lasting 10 days in New York, was crammed with drama. I didn't know where I was. It was, I'd gone thinking it was a Russian conspiracy in England, sure of it, in fact, because I'd met this man Obama. And when I get to the States, by Jove, the same thing's been going on here. Then, when President Kennedy was killed, I thought those who'd attempted to assassinate his character would be number 1 on my list of suspects for killing the man himself. That's how it all arose. So I did start my investigation 5 months before.
Fascinating, and
unbelievable,
that in itself sounds like it deserves treatment in a full book.
It is absolutely unbelievable.
I invite you to write that book as well.
We know that all kinds of intelligence and counterintelligence goes on. We have our CIA and FBI and Secret Service and others with all of their failings and occasional successes. And I suppose all the other nations, including Russia, have the same type of organization. And I suppose there's no more reason to assume that the Russian secret police is any more successful than our CIA or our FBI. I think as long as you have an official body, you have bureaucracy, bungling, and stupidity and so on.
Since I am moderating between 2 distinguished lawyers, I'm almost in the role of judge, and I should invite you, Mr. Eddows, to give your counter-rebuttal, or so-rebuttal, whatever one calls that, to Elmer Gertz's points about Jack Ruby, which
well, of course, I didn't really want to deal with Jack Ruby in my book at all, because I thought he was peripheral to my argument, but I had to do so, because as like motive, people say, well, what's the motive? What has Jack Ruby got to do with it? So I had to say something, otherwise it wouldn't really be a book. So I would deal with Jack Ruby. Now, in testimony to the commission, Jack Ruby said there was a conspiracy. He said, I and all my family will be killed, and Chief Justice Warren, you're in danger, and so are you, Mr. Fowler.
He was hallucinated. We had psychiatric examinations of him. He believed that the Jews were being taken to the basement of the jail.
He said he believed it.
Yes, not only said, he believed it. I have documentary evidence. I myself sent a psychiatrist from this area, Dr. Werner Tudor, to examine him, Dr. Tanay, as he tried to examine him, Dr. West examined him, and there was no question but that he was hallucinated on the subject of what was happening to the Jews because of him.
Mr. Eddows, I can add something on that. My only contact with the Ruby case.
Yes.
One of the people who first examined him was Dr. Roy Schaefer, who was a psychologist and psychodiagnostic expert, and Roy Schaefer was my colleague at Yale University at that time, and a good close friend of mine. Schaefer said in testimony in the original Ruby trial, and after that trial was quite willing to talk to some of his friends along the same lines, that Ruby suffered serious organic deficit, meaning there was neurological damage, quite possibly, as I remember it, due to tertiary syphilis, though I'm not sure that that has all been elaborated.
Dr. Castrabella, who was a well-known psychiatrist here, examined all the psychiatric material, and he believed that there were organic difficulties in the brain.
And they would suggest, certainly, a penchant for hallucinatory and delusional activity as well.
Oh, yes, this would all suggest that. But I say, in my book, because I have to talk about Ruby at all, that his taking of a post office box, first one he ever had in Dallas, 8 feet from that shared by the assassin, and 5 minutes walk from the depository and 10 minutes walk from Jack Ruby's Carousel Club was extraordinary. Secondly, Ruby's friendship with Mrs. Bertha Cheek, who had a long conference with Ruby on the afternoon of the 18th of November 1963. The motorcade had been rehearsed.
About an investment.
What?
About an investment.
He was expected to get a lot of money.
Well, he had all kinds of schemes. He had a so-called twist device, and he was always hoping to get rich, and he also was hoping to open up another nightclub, and he always was filled with hope. A lot of human beings are built that way, including the famous character Micawber.
Since you both agree that Ruby's complicity as a part-time employee of the KGB is not essential to Mr. Eddows' argument, I'd like to move on to something else.
Absolutely.
And this is a point that you share with most of the other conspiracy theorists who have reanalyzed the case in very different terms. You agree with Jim Garrison, with Mark Lane, with Bernard Fensterwald, and with many others that the Warren Commission hushed up the truth.
Yes.
So you see them hushing up the different truth than those others see. Why would it have served the Warren Commission or served the United States for that truth to be hushed up? You seem to suggest they were onto the interpretation that you have now provided. Why would they not then share that with all of us?
Because I think the American people would have risen and would have demanded tremendous reprisals against Russia.
Do you think that our Chief Justice Earl Warren was part of a cover-up?
Yes, I do.
Well, Warren, I beg to differ. Warren was one of the finest characters in American history.
I don't disagree at all. I think he's a magnificent man. But he was pressed in the interest of national security to chair the Warren Commission.
Well, I beg to differ. I can't conceive of Chief Justice Warren knowingly distorting the truth. He might, through ignorance or being misinformed.
Well, Elmer, but there's a point there. I think you're a magnificent man, too, and I've long been an admirer of yours, as I'm sure you know. All the same, if you were in a position where you had become persuaded that there is a lie you must tell publicly to save the United States, would you not commit that lie?
Well, if you read the posthumously published memoirs of Earl Warren, where he sums up the evidence in the case, it's clear to me, at any rate, that he felt the absolute truth was being told in the report. Now, what the report says, and this leaves a lot open, he says there's no question but that Oswald alone killed the president. He says no evidence was adduced to indicate a conspiracy. He doesn't say that it's impossible that there was a conspiracy. I don't say that a conspiracy is impossible. But all I would say is that thus far, nothing proving a conspiracy has come out. The nearest to it, and it's still far away, is what Mr. Eddows has put forth in his book. I regard what Mark Lane and some of the others have said as sheer nonsense. But this is at least a serious thesis. I happen to disagree, but I wouldn't for a moment say that it doesn't show a lot of thought and a lot of study. And it's not impossible even that it might be right. But it doesn't satisfy me that it's right. I see all kinds of possibilities. I think the basic facts or allegations are suppositious. I don't think that they're proved. The material about the difference in size is very impressive until you come across the matter of fingerprints and you say, that's conclusive. The other things could have been erroneous statements, mistaken statements, carelessness, whatever you would have it.
Carelessness in measuring Oswald.
If I'm asked my height or weight, I have a tendency to give different figures. I never remember. I might ask my wife, what's my weight?
But this man was measured against a scale twice. By Marine officers. How could they misread 69 for 71?
You mentioned Marina. What role do you think she played here? Obviously.
I have no idea. Yeah. I wonder if I could deal with some of the questions that you raised.
Fine.
Mr. Eddows, you may, and I want you to, right after I say this is WGN, Clear Channel Radio from Chicago. Please proceed.
Oh, first of all, the Warren report itself excludes all the evidence, which is documentary, of conspiracy in Mexico City, prior espionage of Jaggers Charles Tabal in Dallas, and the fact that the assassin applied for, in writing and in person, on returning from Mexico City to Dallas, for jobs on the only 3 routes that President Kennedy could take to and from the lunch at the Trade Mart. The Warren report does not even mention the most important route of the lot, which was Inwood Road. If President Kennedy was going to pay a one-day visit to Texas, he wouldn't be able to have time to have a motorcade through downtown Dallas. He would proceed straight from Love Field Airport down Inwood Road to be trademarked to the luncheon which he attended. After the luncheon, he did, in fact, and it was always intended that he should,
bungle. But bungling is nothing new. You don't have to have a conspiracy to have a lot of bungling.
Well, but in face of that bungling, particularly by the FBI and the CIA, some other theorists have tended to conclude that the FBI and the CIA were involved in the assassination.
There was concealment, and as Mr. Eddows pointed out, J. Edgar Hoover said that this was such a horrible case of bungling, and the number of people were reprimanded and removed. But that very fact, it seems to me, destroys the hypothesis that J. Edgar Hoover was part of any cover-up.
No, the rest of the people of the FBI wanted him to take no action. He said, I refuse to palliate these actions.
Yes.
And he intended it never to be known outside the Bureau, and he got censored or demoted 20 senior FBI men.
Gentlemen, we're due for some overdue commercials, and then we'll be right on to the telephones. The number, as usual, is 591-7200, 591-7200. We welcome you. Thank you, Marty McNeely. We are drawing tonight from Michael Eddows' most interesting new book, The Oswald File. That book just published in this country by Clarkson N. Potter Incorporated, distributed by Crown Publishers. Joining us as well in the conversation is Elmer Gertz, professor of law at the John Marshall Law School, one of Chicago's most distinguished trial attorneys. The phone number 591-7200, and here is the first call. Good evening.
With those who say that there were shots from other directions besides the school book depository. Now, there are some very acute critics like Josiah Thompson with his book 6 Seconds in Dallas, who analyzed the ballistics evidence, the Zapruder film. And they say that the fact that the president's body was thrown back to the left, and also the fact that the angle of the bullet that went through Governor Connolly could not be correlated with the shot that hit the president in the back.
Yes, that's some of that ballistics evidence that I mentioned earlier.
How would they explain it away?
Yeah, the Zapruder film does show the head of the president going, what you say is the wrong direction. But there is scientific evidence that that's a natural reflex action in those circumstances.
When hit in the skull.
Yes, I don't think in that respect Mr. Eddows and I differ. There is a natural explanation. If you, by objective evidence, have to eliminate anything being fired in front or from the grassy knoll, and you have to assume that the shots came from the rear and above, then you have to find some explanation as to the head action. And there is scientific evidence. In fact, the best scientific evidence is that's a natural reflex. I don't profess to be a physicist or physiologist, but I'm quite satisfied that that's the best evidence I've seen, and I'm completely unpersuaded by the guesswork of others in that area.
Yes, I entirely agree with that. I've considered all the ballistic evidence, I've considered everything, and I'm quite satisfied that because the rifle was found, 3 cartridges were found, the man was seen firing the last shot from the window, the third shot from the window. He was seen by Howard Brennan, who'd heard the first 2 shots, glanced up and saw the man fire the third shot. I'm quite satisfied that the concrete evidence obscures any possibility of there being another assassin. But my real reason for thinking there wasn't a second assassin is that escape is absolutely essential if there was a conspiracy. And if you've got 2 people firing from different directions, you double the risk of one of them being caught, as it was. The assassin was caught. Does it? I hope it answers your question, but I know it's not satisfactory to you, but it would take us weeks to go into all the ballistic evidence.
I just hope that you can debate a bit with some of the other critics.
Incidentally, Merriman Smith, the famous newspaper man who was an expert shot and knew how to detect sound, happened to be in the very spot where you could tell best where the rifle was fired. And he said from the very first moment that there were 3 shots and only 3 shots, and they were from the above and the rear. And he is by far the most credible of all witnesses.
Sir, we thank you for the call. And on to another. Good evening, you're on the air.
Yes, I was wondering, if there is in fact no conspiracy, then why is the current investigating committee claiming that they may need as many as 100 to 150 prosecuting witnesses. What's the word I'm looking for?
I don't know, I'm afraid.
I think there's an explanation. The American people, rightly or wrongly, are suspicious of the whole thing. And as long as they're suspicious, they're entitled to have another investigation to clear up whatever doubts there are.
Okay, but they're talking about possibly needing 100 to 150 witnesses who they will not prosecute. They're granting them immunity. That's the word I was looking for.
Oh, yes.
And why would they need to grant this many people immunity?
When I see what evidence they adduce, I'll be able to give the answer. Right now, I don't know why they need that many.
I don't know why they want to give them immunity either, but I think it's not unreasonable to give them immunity. But anyway, we shall see. I wish I could add. I wish I could help you, but I can't.
Sir, we thank you for the call.
Okay, thank you.
But I wonder, don't both of you agree that the fact that Congress is now once again seized of this whole question and is initiating a major new investigation does suggest that
people are skeptical.
Is it really a response to skepticism by the American people, or is it rather based upon some evidence that has already been gathered which suggests that at least the Warren Commission version of it all is wrong?
Well, we know to a certainty that CIA and FBI concealed information from the Warren Commission, and that in and of itself justifies an investigation.
I agree with that, yes.
Yeah. With that, back to the telephones. Good evening, you're on the air.
I have two questions. The first question I'd like to ask these gentlemen, is it true that two top expert riflemen from the FBI tried to fire 3 rounds from where Oswald would supposedly have shot his shots, and at that distance could not do it?
No, it's not true.
It's not.
As a matter of fact, not only do we have the test made through the prosecution and others, through the Warren Commission representatives, but CBS had 2 distinct programs on the subject, and they showed that it was quite easily done.
To get off 3 rounds in that short period of firing at that distance?
CBS demonstrated that it could be done.
I could do it myself, actually. I was an expert rifleman at one time. I know that I could have done it.
Okay.
And with the telescopic sight, which brought the assassin's head to a range of 20 yards only for the first shot. And remember, the first cartridge was in the rifle. He had to work the bolt twice, and he could do this quite easily within.
Wasn't there also a question, though, about the rather inadequate weapon that he used, a rather cheap rifle that was not properly sighted or coordinated? Doesn't that raise the suggestion of shots from some other source as well?
No, I don't
Not
think
to me. No, not to me. No. I think
a lot
it was
of people have been killed
rifle.
with faulty weapons. You're just as dead when you're killed with a faulty weapon as if a good weapon were used.
And the second part of my question, if I may ask it, gentlemen, is what is the thinking of, when Mr. Gertz made the comment that he felt that how the Russians could not have manipulated Oswald? Wouldn't you think that a man as weak emotionally as Oswald, disorientated, not knowing what he wanted out of life, traveling from here to there, wouldn't he be just the perfect individual that they would pick up and train and manipulate? They wouldn't pick a strong man, they'd pick a weak one.
Yeah. Mr. Eddows doesn't say they took the real Oswald. He says they have somebody else, not Oswald, not the real Oswald.
I see. Well, I don't know. I just wanted to get your comment on that. It didn't seem very logical to me.
Sir, we thank you for the call.
Thank you.
That does raise the question. It's only incidental, and again, your thesis doesn't stand or fall on your answer to this question, but what then might have happened to the real Oswald?
Oh, I think that he was seized immediately upon his arrival in the Soviet Union. This has happened on many occasions. This is known to have happened. And a lookalike returned to some other country. There are probably half a dozen working all over Europe and America today.
Well, you do mention one British case, Gordon Lonsdale.
Yeah.
And what was the exact story there? Was it demonstrated that Lonsdale,
wasn't necessarily a lookalike, but he looked well like Lonsdale might have looked when he was grown up. He took the identity of this boy.
And he was in fact a Russian?
He was in fact a GRU intelligence officer. Yes, Coral Melody.
Who had been substituted as a British scientist.
As a Canadian, he'd take the Canadian boy's identity and came to the United States, into London, spied for a long time. They were ultimately caught where the British intelligence got him. They thought he was Gordon Lonsdale, a Canadian. He was absolutely perfect. He knew everything about Canada, his accent and everything.
Yes.
And they discovered that he had not been circumcised, and the boy had.
You know, what Mr. Eddows says in this book isn't necessarily untrue. it's very difficult to say it is true. The evidence is lacking in many particulars. Much of it, some of the basic material, is suppositious. That's my quarrel with it. I don't say it's impossible. Stranger things have happened in this.
Could you tell me what is supposition, Mr. Coates?
Of your 9 things, I would say virtually all of them are suppositions. You may remember...
When enlarged upon in the book, there's no supposition and no speculation.
Well, at the last part, your final conclusion is that the imposter, Oswald, de Mohrenschildt, and Ruby participated in a conspiracy. I fail to see any evidence of participation of either Mohrenschildt or Ruby in any conspiracy having as its purpose the assassination
Well, I'll tell you, if I may, one moment interrupt you. This is very interesting. When I read the testimony of the 2 de Mohrenschildts, husband and wife, my assistants and I worked with a lot of people on this in London, were quite satisfied that George de Mohrenschildt was a KGB agent. And when I came to Clarkson Potter, I saw the editor-in-chief, and I came with the script of this book, and she listened in astonishment as I told her. I said, I believe it's a true story. And if you publish this book in June, which we intended to do first, George de Mohrenschildt will either flee the country or commit suicide. My exact words, which can be checked with the editor-in-chief of Clarkson Potter. He did both. He fled, and then he committed suicide. I believe programmed.
Is there, Mr. Eddows, of de Mohrenschildt knowing Ruby? Let's forget. He knew Oswald. No question about his knowing Oswald.
Well,
what evidence is there that he knew Jack Ruby?
The only evidence that I have is this, that in 1956, 7 and 8, in a square block, Hall, Rawlins, Throckmorton, and 4th Street, I can't remember, in suburban Dallas, they both had access to apartments for that number of years. And these apartments ran down the sides of the block. They were sort of 2-story houses. And in the middle of the block was a wide passageway. And I cannot believe, even if they were not associated as conspirators in assassination, that 2 such talkative and gregarious and large men could have missed each other in a distance of 100 yards over a period of 3 years.
Our phone number is 591-7200, and we'll be right back to your calls. And I'm very eager to get right back to the telephones. Here is... Back to your calls. And I'm very eager to get right back to the telephones. Here is the next call. Good evening.
Good evening.
Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to ask Mr. Eddows, and I have read his book, if the written communications of Oswald, which many of them were rather... The grammatical errors were so simple, and I wondered, because I don't know any Russian, or anything about Russian, if there were mistakes that, say, a Russian-speaking person would make, if he ever, if that came into any of his thinking.
Are you referring, ma'am, particularly to the diaries that were discovered in his...
Diaries, yes, and some of the letters he wrote to supposedly to the Russians, trying to get passports, trying to get back into Russia and into Cuba.
Into America. Oh, I see. Yes.
Even his letters home.
There are considerable differences between the contents of what is called the historic diary, alleged to be kept by the real Oswald in Russia, and letters that this man actually wrote to the American embassy. They were extremely literate. I would have difficulty in writing such literate letters myself.
Right.
And complete contradiction to the contents of the historic diary. This creates an immediate suggestion there might have been 2 Oswalds in Russia. One a lookalike, whose name I believe was Alec, and the real Oswald, who was, without wishing to do so, training him in the real Oswald's background. But I should first perhaps tell you something that most people don't know. And what I'm telling you was omitted from the Warren Report. In June 1960, J. Edgar Hoover warned the American embassy in Moscow that there is a possibility that there was an imposter using the physical data shown on Oswald's birth certificate, which Oswald, the real Oswald, had taken to Russia. That was the first warning against imposture. That was excluded from the Warren Report and placed in the archives.
And only recently declassified, right?
No, one of the researchers got it out.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the next warning came in March 1961. This came from Edward J. Hickey, Deputy Chief of the Passport Office. In a memorandum from the Consular Section of the Department of State, he said, I quote, "This file contains information first which indicates that mail from the mother of this boy is not being delivered to him, and second, that it has been stated that there is an imposter using Oswald's identification data, and that no doubt the Soviets would love to get hold of his valid passport. It is my opinion that the passport should be delivered to him only on a personal basis, and after the embassy is satisfied to its complete satisfaction that he is returning to the United States. Now we now have two warnings. The second one says that it has been stated that there is an imposter in Russia. Now we come to the third warning by the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk himself. And this says as follows: July 1961. The embassy's careful attention to the involved case of Mr. Oswald is appreciated. It is assumed that there is no doubt that the person who has been in communication with the embassy is the person who has issued a passport in the name of Lee Harvey Oswald. Now here's the Secretary of State warning the embassy in Moscow to be absolutely certain the man they were dealing with was the real Lee Harvey Oswald. And it's absolutely incredible because in the Warren report itself, that last sentence is omitted from the report and is represented by 3 asterisks.
Mr. Eddows, don't you think that if Mr. Hoover or anyone else had suspicion that there might be a substitution, that thereafter they would carry down surveillance of the imposter so that it would have been impossible for him to assassinate anyone or to carry on any espionage work or anything of that nature?
Well, it is disclosed in Book 5 of the Senate Intelligence Investigation that Hoover did give this warning, and that none of the FBI agents who were in contact with Oswald were ever told that there might be an impostor. That is in Book 5.
But if Mr. Hoover thought there might be, don't you think he would have followed through? You don't think Mr. Hoover was just hoping that this man would commit some mischief, including the killing of the president?
Well, first of all, I think it's an extraordinary thing the Warren Commission should have omitted these 3 warnings from the Warren report. That's
maybe they weren't told of it.
Maybe they were not told. Maybe they were not
exactly
told. Well, they were told of the Rusk one because they had got it.
Yeah.
All of it except the last sentence. They were told of the Rusk one.
See, they had 26 volumes of evidence. The report is about 800-some pages. So obviously they couldn't get everything into the report. It was a matter of judgment what went into the report.
Well, Mr. Gertz, having read the report, first of all, and having sat like the average person in this country hoping for all the answers, and not being trained legally or in much of any other way, finding the report to be a rather garrulous mess.
No,
I mean, it didn't take a lawyer to figure out that they didn't follow through on a lot of things that...
When you read the report, you find that it seems on the surface a very carefully done document. Now, since then, we've had all kinds of questions raised, but most of the questions that have been raised, except perhaps by Mr. Eddows, are based completely upon what is in the 26 volumes of testimony produced and published by the Commission. Seems
well,
to me
exactly where you can argue.
It seems to me that if the Commission were covering up, it would not publish the data which could be used to prove its cover-up.
I wonder. I mean, obviously nobody really thought that it wouldn't come out someday. It was like a little... In the first place, how many people read it before the newspapers and the publications that everybody did read were telling how great it was?
No.
And I read it, and it was awfully hard to get through, yet the minute it was released, everybody said it's perfect. I mean, all the papers, all the things I read, and I plowed through it laboriously, and I looked for answers. I expected our government to come up with the answers. I expected the FBI to come up with the answers. I had the utmost faith in them. And even I could sit and say, why wasn't this asked? Why didn't they do that? And if they did, why haven't they told us?
I am a trained lawyer, and I'm a trained historian, and I read the report, and I regarded it at first and second reading as an extremely sound document. Now, later, I had some questions to ask, and I haven't always gotten the answers.
And, ma'am, I'm a trained talk show host, and so I've got to say goodnight to you because we've got to take care of some commercials. Thank you for an interesting call. A moment out to talk about programs to come. We're very enthusiastic about the ones we've got lined up. Tomorrow night we're going to be talking about a recent study on female sexuality. The authors of that study will be joined by Howard Maltz, who is a leading sexological researcher at the University of Chicago. Next week, Monday, we'll be off the air, preempted by NFL football. But on Tuesday, we'll be back to talk about the new automobiles, the cars of 1978. Our guests will be the two automotive editors for the Chicago Tribune and the Sun-Times, respectively, and a professor of mechanical engineering who specializes in automotive matters. Wednesday next week, we're going to get nostalgic, and we'll do a retrospective on the big band sound. Chuck Suber, the editor of Downbeat magazine, will be with us, bringing along some wonderful selections from his record collection, and Dick Buckley, host of the Jazz Forum on WBEZ as well. Thursday next week, What's New in Outer Space? Herbert Rowe, the associate administrator of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, will be one of our guests. Peter Reith, the science reporter for the Chicago Tribune, who follows these matters closely, and John Simpson, a leading space researcher who is professor of physics at the University of Chicago. And Friday next week, a special program on just how private are our private lives and who's poking into them. For now, let's get directly back to our inquiry into the Kennedy assassination. The phone number 591-7200. You are on the air. Good evening.
Hello.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I would like to ask this question. That it seems to me, in reading all the various books and reports and so forth, that there is a mystery about every major phase of the whole event, including the investigations. You can't name me, I don't think, any part of it. I mean, from Oswald's leaving Japan to be discharged. I think you're familiar with the details. The general said that he couldn't get out in less than 2 weeks. But here's a corporal or whatever he was getting out at 24-hour notice. And right on down the line, including the autopsy that was done in Washington and the president, where they employed doctors who had no particular skill or experience at gunshot wounds, who burned their notes when they got through, and they couldn't agree with each other the location of the bullets, and every phase of it has just been a hodgepodge.
Well, that's selecting some details. You have to go by and large. You know, over a century after Lincoln's assassination, they're still quarreling over details, though we know to a certainty that it was Booth who killed Lincoln.
Well, I don't know that we do know that, but Mr. Gertz, while you're talking there, you said before that they wouldn't pick the grassy knoll as a site to shoot from because of the difficulties for going through windshields and so forth. And yet...
And difficulty in aiming.
Yeah, well, by the same theory, though, you got the assassin using a $19 piece of junk as a gun, using bullets that was 35 years old.
It wasn't junk. It killed the President of the United States.
Well, I don't think that's been proven. I mean, they first identified the gun as a Mauser, and it stood that way for about 3 hours.
No, the police misidentified it. See, what you're doing is what often is done. That in a long report and a long investigation, there are bound to be many errors. What you should do is to take the basic evidence and see what that adds up to. The basic evidence adds up to the one who might talk of as Lee Harvey Oswald, and the other participant talking of as an imposter. We agree that that person, whoever he was, whether the real Oswald or an imposter, killed the president.
Well,
we don't differ on it, and I think that everyone...
You don't differ, you mean?
What is that?
You don't differ.
Well, let me phrase it this way. There are all kinds of people, some in good faith, some in bad faith, who differ. Those in whom I have confidence who had no axes to grind, like CBS, it had no axe to grind, and twice it carried on investigations in good faith and reached essentially the same conclusions as the Warren Report.
Well, let me ask you this about that CBS. They made no mention, as I recall, of the reverse frame of film in the Zapruder film.
Oh, yes, that's been discussed.
But not by CBS.
Well, maybe I don't remember every detail, but that's been discussed in various places. There's no mystery about the Zapruder film. After all, who produced it? It was studied by the Warren Commission. It was used in various places.
I'm talking about reversing the frame.
I don't think there's anything gained by either of us or our listeners if we go over petty details. What we have to do is to see if there was enough evidence to prove Oswald guilty of the murder beyond reasonable doubt. And I think there's no doubt about that.
Sir, we'll give you a last word if you'd like, and then we must ask.
No, I know when it's too much for me.
We thank you for the call.
Yeah, okay.
Good night. Hello, you're on the air.
Yes, my thought moves me to wonder why, if the assassin was a hired assassin or trained assassin, why Dallas in the Southwest? If he came to this country to stalk the president, why not one of the northeastern cities, the West Coast, or even Chicago, where the president might be anticipated to visit 2 or 3 times a year, rather than Texas, where he was typically staying away from?
A very interesting question, Mr. Eddows.
Oh, yes. You see, the original real Lee Harvey Oswald lived in Fort Worth, which is 35 miles from Dallas. And they are really twin cities. They join up, really. And therefore it was the best thing for the imposter to use the area that had been lived in by the man he was impersonating, which he did.
Well, he might have waited 2, 3, 5 years for the president to come
He might have waited.
create the opportunity.
Oh, of course he would.
Except that a presidential campaign was coming on, and Texas was a decisive state, so they knew the president was going to be in Texas.
I wonder, Mr. Eddows, this
Yeah,
is merely
but
this is merely in the area of conjecture.
Yeah.
But if it was a KGB plot ordered by the Politburo and ultimately by Premier Khrushchev, would not the proper way to have done this would not the proper way have been to send 5 or 6 such men under false identity into the country, each of them ready to execute the order if he became the appropriate person?
I have never believed for one moment that there was only one man. I think there were other lookalikes in the United States prepared to do the same job, but I have no evidence, of course.
In other words, agents in place waiting for their use.
Yeah.
What would you then assume has happened to them since?
Well, I've no idea. I don't even know if there were any, but it's a good suggestion, that is all.
Back to the caller. Yes, sir.
Well, that's response, Mike.
We thank you very much. The number is 591-7200. We'll be right back. That.
Well, you mentioned that the measurements were gained in many different ways by many different people, right?
Yes, there were fingerprints taken at various times in various places, and they agreed. We have no doubt. Now, with respect to the mastoid operation, it may be that since Dr. Rose and the others were informed about it, they didn't look for that particular thing. Mr. Eddows has also mentioned different locations for scars. Well, I don't know what the explanation is. I know that very often there's a slip-up in those things.
But one should, of course, never underestimate the scope of human sloppiness when it comes to ordinary performance of one's professional
Dr. Rose in
responsibility.
general was regarded as a very good pathologist. I wouldn't be critical of him. In general, he had a good reputation, a deserved reputation.
But I'll tell you, Elmer, I still do remain quite bothered by the discrepancy between 5 feet 9 and 5
Oh, I
feet
am
11.
too. I don't pretend that I'm not. But I say that if the fingerprints are genuine, then you have to find some explanation as to the difference in height. That was the error. If the fingerprints are genuine, then there's no question about the identity. It's accepted as 100% proof of identity. There's nobody doubts anymore that fingerprint evidence, even if they're incomplete, if you have a finger sometimes instead of a whole hand, that's considered to be decisive evidence, and I'd like to see some evidence to overcome it. We only have surmised that there was a substitution of fingerprints. We have no proof that there was.
Sir, we thank you for the call.
Thank you.
Good night. Here is another. Good evening, you're on the air. Hello, are you there?
Hello?
Yes, sir, you're on the air.
Yes. I wanted to address my question to Elmer Gert. Every book I've read, and I've read everything that's been published, makes a big point of the unusual, likelihood of the percentages of all the witnesses dying violent deaths or dying. And are we being fed a lot of bunk about that?
Yes,
What
I
is
think so.
the question?
Well, if you live long enough, then you'll witness everybody die.
Well, I know.
Most of those who are cited as having something to do with the case had nothing whatever to do with it. For example, Dorothy Kilgallen. What in the world did she have to do?
She had a lot to do.
No, she was just a reporter, and she had nothing, and nobody claimed she had anything whatsoever to do with the case. She had no first-hand knowledge of anything.
Well, now,
she was a good reporter.
She's the popular example, but what about all those other people?
There is not one. Well,
You say that, but how do you prove that?
Now, who did all the killing? Now, do you think it's possible that if there were a concerted effort to kill everyone, that we would have not one shred of evidence as to who did it?
Nobody has investigated.
Oh, yes.
I don't
say that. When, with all the suspicion, you can be sure that there are ongoing investigations. You would have to have the most gigantic conspiracy in history, and we have no evidence of it.
Mr. Eddows, do you have any views on this matter?
I haven't any views at all. A few people died mysteriously, particularly the stripper who received $25 from Jack Ruby just for performing his...
Jack Ruby.
Yeah.
I also knew Jack Ruby back in Chicago.
Yeah. Can I, though, speak about something you did not yourself raise, and that is the question of fingerprints. First of all, the marine fingerprints of Lee Harvey Oswald were never produced to the Commission in testimony. They were never proved as being the marine fingerprints, and therefore I cannot accept that card as being the genuine card of the marine's fingerprints. If, however, it was the genuine card, and if the bodies of the marine and the assassin differ, somebody must have forged that fingerprint card.
Yes, sir, I'll get off the air.
That is very interesting what you said there.
In all the reports, the arguments that Jenner and Mr. Gertz give supporting the Warren Commission, it isn't an argument about what they told. It's what they didn't tell.
I couldn't agree more.
And I'll get off the air.
We thank you for the call.
Thank you.
There is yet another batch of evidence, Mr. Eddows, that you do comment on in the book that we haven't developed tonight at all. The material found in, quote, Oswald's room. I'm putting the quotes around Oswald. That's what you do in the book.
Yes, in his wallet and in the room. Yes. Well, there's a firm in Dallas called Jaggers Charles Tobel, a very respectable firm indeed. And the assassin obtained employment there in the name of Lee Harvey Oswald by a trick. It was said that he had obtained employment through the Texas Employment Commission, but in fact he hadn't, because it does not enter the Texas Employment Commission records. Now, he worked in the camera department, and he worked with his friend, a 38-year-old man called John Caesar Grossi, who'd been employed in the alias of Jack Leslie Byrne, the alias of Jack Leslie Byrne. This man was a long-term criminal, but he was the assassin's friend and worked on the cameras with the assassin in the firm of Jaggers Charles Tobel, who did highly secret work, I quote, for the Army Map Service at the time of the Cuba crisis and at the vital moment of the Cuba crisis, when Kennedy got the first hard preliminary evidence that there were missiles on Cuba. The assassin, on his first working day, executed work for the Army Map Service. After the assassination, where he lived, was found a Minox camera, that is a spy camera, about the size of a large thumb, 2 other cameras, 2 binoculars, 1 telescope, 1 pedometer, 1 compass, and a hunting knife in sheath, and a mass of exposed and unexposed film. It is known that the assassin never took a social photograph while in the United States after coming from Russia, and never went hunting. None of this, absolutely not one word of this, is